Welcome to our second asynchronous lesson, and in this video we're going to talk about writing scientific papers, and by that I mean writing lab reports. So the learning objectives that we're going to cover in this video are we're going to learn about writing a scientific lab report, including all of the relevant sections, and then we'll end by analyzing and critiquing lab reports. So, quick survey. When was the last time you wrote a scientific paper? I want you to think about it. What class was it for? What was the context? Do you have a lot of experience writing scientific papers? Not a lot of experience writing scientific papers? What I want you to realize is that you've probably written a lab report before, but for this class, because it's a writing class, we're really going to focus on the specifics to make sure that you do it correctly. So, general guidelines. Start early. Scientific reports, lab reports, these take a while, so you don't want to put it off till last minute. Save often. You never know when your computer could crash or that file could be lost. So make sure you hit that save button and also save it to a few different places, not just your computer, but also some sort of cloud-based like the OneDrive or your own personal Google Drive. These are all great places to save your scientific reports. You want to make sure it's formatted correctly. In a lab report, we never use quotations. We just don't do it. And you want to be objective, but persuasive. There's a goal here. You're trying to convince someone of something. So the sections of a lab report, they appear in one order, but they are written in a different order. So you don't write the lab report in the order in which you read a lab report. In the order that they appear, it starts with the title, which is descriptive. Then there's an abstract, an introduction, methods, results, discussion, references, and in the lab reports you're going to submit, we're going to put all of our tables and figures at the end. In the order that they are written, however, you start with the methods, and then you do the tables and the figures, and then you write up the results, the discussion, the introduction, references, abstract, and the last thing you do is come up with a title. So methods, these are usually written first. And this is where you want to describe what you did in enough detail that someone could repeat your study without any sort of extraneous details. You don't need to tell me that you labeled your samples with a Sharpie marker or you set the tubes into the dish. That is not needed, okay? You can also reference papers here if you've done the same method before. So say you always do a heat shock assay with your nematodes. You can reference the last paper that you wrote and say, see previously described methods, something like that, okay? You do not want to include a bulleted list or a numbered step, so it should read and flow in a paragraph. You want to identify your control and your treatment groups. You can even name them if you would like. And you want to talk about here the calculations and statistical methods. So the specific equation that you used, a description of the variables. This is where that information goes. And methods are written in the past tense because theoretically you're talking about something that you've already done. So it's in the past. Common mistakes, issues with calculations. So always make sure that they're formatted correctly. I know that can be a little bit challenging. And then you also want to make sure you use the correct equipment and you know what the equipment is. So this is taken from another lab report for another class, and you can see we talked about different types of filters that water collection is used in. And this is important because for scientists, different equipment works differently and has different caveats, and so you always want to be specific about the machines that you're using. Okay, so the next thing you do is you do your tables and your figures for your results section. Never include the raw data, so this should not look like a data sheet, okay? And your tables and figures should also not include the same information. If you can write it, if you can portray the information in a figure, just use the figure. The figure is usually better. You want to refer to all of your tables and figures in the text and in the right order. So you don't want to reference table 3 before table 2. And you want to use proper in-text citations when you're talking about your figures. And your tables and figures should be formatted appropriately with labels and titles. Nothing hand-drawn. Hand-drawn is not going to cut it. Okay, so you want to make sure that they're appropriately labeled, right? So we have axes labels, we have a title, we have a nice graph, same with a table, right? Nicely labeled. Common mistakes are when you just include the raw data or you don't have any axis titles or incorrect axis ranges, okay? Then after you put together your tables and your figures, you want to talk about them in the results section. This is the summary of the results, where you talk about the major trends and the major things that you've observed, and you reference your tables and your figures. So you want to say, rather than just saying light intensity is presented in figure 1, you don't want to talk about them by name, you want to talk about what they show. So light intensity showed an exponential decrease with depth, parentheses, figure 1. So you want to explain what happens as opposed to saying figure 1 by itself. Now, in the results section, this is not the area where you add any discussion, so no interpretation of the results. Don't say why it's important or what it means. You just want to present the facts and include relevant statistics. No references are in this section, and it's also, again, written in that past tense, what you found out when you did these experiments. Okay, so common mistakes. The major one people will get messed up on is including the discussion. So when they start to say this could be due to the fact that there's a temporary thermocline was noted, no. That is a discussion. That's an explanation. The most accurate measurement I feel is the temperature. Again, that's a discussion. Results, you just say what happens. This is where the interpretation comes. Now we're in the discussions. We did the methods, we did the tables and figures, we did our results section. Now let's explain and interpret our results. You want to answer questions like, what do these results mean? Do they support the hypothesis? Yes, no. Do some of the results contradict other results? What are the implications of these results? What new knowledge does these results create? You want to put them in the context of your study and the specificity of the organism that you're using. You start specific in a discussion section. So it's considered a triangle. You start very specific. Was my hypothesis supported? And you get more and more broad, so you end with these broad implication statements. How does this fit into the context of what we know and what is unknown in the field? You assume your methods are good. So when we talk about if your results are contradictory or implications, you don't say anything about human error or the machine might not have worked. You assume all of that worked, otherwise you wouldn't be writing this paper, okay? You want to compare your findings to those of previous findings. Do they agree? Why? Are they in contrast? Why? And again, your experiment didn't fail if your hypothesis was not supported, right? You're still learning things if you find out that you have a null hypothesis. And again, discussions are written in the past tense. And the exception is when you're talking about common knowledge statements. Those you can write in the present tense. Cells are the foundation of life. Present tense because it's a general knowledge statement. The specifics, those are written in the past tense because they're talking about experiments you did in the past. Common mistakes here, not putting things into context and not fully understanding the background information necessary to accurately interpret your results. This is the thinking part. So in your discussion, this is when you need to really think about things. Okay. After you've written the end, now you're going to go back, you're going to write the beginning, you're going to write the introduction. And you want to provide a context for the study that you're doing. Why is this important? Why is this exciting? What do people already know? What don't we know? What is the gap in the current knowledge? What could be better understood? What knowledge does everyone need to be on the same page with to better understand the subject? Now, this is the main part where you put in those references. You want to include the things that are important, but don't include all the papers. So don't just word vomit out 100 references. You want to include the big stuff. And we talk about the structure of an introduction like an inverted triangle. So you start off broad. Why is this a big deal? Why should I as a reader care? Then you move in, you get a little bit more specific. What do we know? What don't we know? And you end with the most specific about your current study. What's the point? What's your hypothesis? What's your prediction? What's your objective? You want to treat every report like a real scientific project. So don't say things like, in lab class, we did this experiment. No. You're a scientist now. This is an experiment you did, period. Again, past or present tense, you're going to use present for generally accepted facts. Wind affects the depths of a mixed layer. That's a generally accepted fact. Whereas when you're talking about previous studies, you want to obviously use the past tense. Previous studies have demonstrated that. Okay. The end of your hypothesis, you're going to include things like your hypothesis. At the end of the introduction, you're going to include things like your hypothesis, rather. So remember, there's a difference between a hypothesis and a prediction, and you're going to tie it back to the broad context of your experiment. So we hypothesize that C. elegans stress response is dependent on the expression of heat check genes. That's a hypothesis. So the prediction that comes from that is if we turn off the heat check genes, the C. elegans will die following a stressful situation. Hypothesis can lead to a prediction. And you want to end with the so what, the objective. Why is this important? By elucidating the role of heat check genes, we can then study the use of drugs that target these genes to improve stress resistance. So hypothesis, prediction, and then the so what, the objective. And that all happens at the very end of your introduction. Common mistakes here are including incorrect information, describing like a lab activity as opposed to describing your experiments, not providing a hypothesis or not including a prediction. Again, you start with an observation, flashlight didn't work. It leads to a hypothesis, the batteries are dead. A prediction, if my hypothesis is true, then replacing the batteries will make my flashlight work. Remember that preferred format for a hypothesis statement includes a predicted effect, the preferred format. So our hypothesis, we want to talk about our independent variable and our dependent variable and give some sort of rationale. And that leads us to our prediction, right? Then the manipulation of that independent variable should have a predicted effect. So hypotheses lead to predictions. After you write your introduction, that's where you put together all your references. Again, because your introduction is where you include most of those references, you then want to have a nice, neat reference section. In scientific lab reports, we never directly quote a reference. Even if you want to put in quotes, don't put in quotes. Instead, paraphrase, paraphrase, paraphrase. Remember the correct way to reference something. In a previous study, bluegill responded more strongly to changes in food quantity. Parentheses, Carroll et al. 2016. If you have just one author, Carroll 2016. If you have two authors, Carroll and Lee 2016. More than two, that's when you use et al. Multiple references need to be in chronological order. And so if you're talking about multiple studies that showed that bluegill responded more strongly to changes in food quantity, you would put the first one that came out, so the 2015 article, then the 2016, then the 2017. And the citation style, I recommend following the journal Nature, as it's a very common, well-established style. But if you're writing for a specific field, you need to make sure you look up the major journal for that field. And the most important part is to be consistent. Okay. Then you're going to write your abstract. This is a 250 to 300 word summary of your paper that includes just a little bit from each section. Very, very little from the method. So not specific details, just broad strokes for the method. And this is the last section that you write, but the first one the readers will read, and many are going to determine if they even read the paper depending on their abstract. So you want to make it catchy. You want to show how it relates to other people's work. Okay, and then you end by writing the title. The title should be descriptive but concise, and the reader should have an idea of what you did after reading the title. So rather than saying Acton Lake Lab Report, you want to instead say examining stratification patterns of temperature, oxygen, and light in a eutrophic Ohio reservoir. Better. More descriptive, gives you an idea of what happened. And again, in any title, you want to have both your independent variable, your dependent variable, as well as the organism or system that you studied. Okay, so for that, we have now reached the end of scientific papers. You are now ready to do the activity on lab reports.